the program, which is a tech chat. We have Selina Wang here from Bloomberg News. So lucky to have her here. She's just out of the studio from San Francisco and raced here to be here. So we really appreciate that, Selina. And we have Phil Libin from All Turtles. And Phil also has quite a bit of experience in China. He is the former CEO and the founder of Evernote in China. And Evernote is one of the success stories in China. But we're going to be hearing a little bit about that experience and also what he's doing now with All Turtles. So Selina and Phil, why don't you come on up and take the stage? Thank you.
Thanks for that introduction. We've got plenty of chairs for the two of us. Yeah. So Phil, as Rebecca mentioned, you were the founder and CEO of Evernote, then you joined General Catalyst, and now you've started All Turtles, which you call an AI startup studio. So why go in that direction after working in venture capital?
Well, I was a VC for about 2 years at General Catalyst, and just... It's okay? Yeah, great. So yeah, Evernote was my third startup, and then I was a VC for about 2 years at General Catalyst, and decided I just really missed doing things more hands-on. So I didn't want to work on just one product, but I also wanted something more active than investing. So, getting to work on a kind of a dozen things in an active way seemed like the right mix.
And you've talked a lot about how the traditional venture startup ecosystem is broken. We have a lot of venture capitalists in this room and out there. What's broken, and what are you trying to solve with your studio model?
Well, I think that the traditional kind of Silicon Valley style startup venture system, it's pretty inefficient. Like, it only leads to success in pretty narrow cases, in pretty geographically narrow cases, really, centered around here and now maybe around Beijing and a small number of other places in the world. Only certain types of ideas get worked on. Only certain types of people get to work on them. There's just too many filters. It's too narrow. I don't think that. I think that there's brilliant people all over the world, and there are many different ages and backgrounds, and they don't all get to use that brilliance for something useful. And I think part of that is because of the very narrow funnel that traditional venture capital and startups kind of funnel people. So we just want to be much broader, much more inclusive than...
Actually, I'm curious. How many people in the audience are investors or venture capitalists? Raise your hands. Okay. So still quite a few of them. And 2018 was actually a record year, I think, when it comes to deal flow and the number of private companies invested in. So do you think that if we're talking, say, in 5 to 10 years, that when we talk about the venture capital model, that it's going to be somewhat outdated? Is it going to decrease in its influence?
Yeah, I think if you look at the value created from technology, was just limited to kind of tech investment. If you look at the value created from technology, I think in a few years, a lot more of it will be global. So as a percentage, less will come from the 50 miles around this building. And I think a larger percentage of it won't come from venture capital structure. There's lots of other structures of investment that aren't necessarily VC. I think a traditional venture capital structure has had a couple of decades of really dominating new value created from technology in this area. But I think whether or not in absolute numbers that grows or shrinks, I don't really care. I think relative to everything else, it'll be much smaller than it has been over the past decade.
So can you walk me through how All Turtles brings entrepreneurs into this studio and actually creates products that are commercialized?
The company that we're really trying to emulate is Netflix. We're basically trying to take a model that worked really well in Hollywood and just apply it to our industry, to tech. 20 years ago, Hollywood was very similar to how Silicon Valley tech works now. It was very hit-driven. It was a small number of insiders that basically captured most of the value. It was a pretty terrible asset class. Like, if you were a sophisticated outside investor, you would not want to invest in Hollywood 20 years ago. If you were one of the 50 insiders that could pass deals to each other, you could make money. But as an asset class, it made a lot of money. It lost a lot of money, just like kind of venture capital on average loses money here. The ideas were kind of not super creative. Work was very, very geographically isolated. Like basically all of the high budget stuff was made around LA and a little bit in New York and pretty much nothing else in the world. It was just kind of stale. And then companies like Netflix came along, not just Netflix, but Netflix, Pixar, HBO, Amazon Video, and now we're in the golden age of content, right? The quality of TV shows and movies is better than it's ever been. It's made not just in Hollywood, but all over the world, right? Netflix has studios in many different countries. All of it is high production value. All of it has a global long-tail distribution chain. The types of ideas are much more creative. And as an asset class, as a business model, it's much stronger. Like Netflix is worth more than all the traditional Hollywood studios put together. So we're really just trying to pretty shamelessly apply that to tech.
And it's an interesting analogy because in this round of Oscar season, one of the Netflix movies is pretty much in almost every category of nomination, which is fascinating. That's really the first.
And they just
year we're
published a
seeing
bunch of stats for the first time, so we actually see like what percentage of entertainment, like eyeballs, they have, and it's a lot. I mean, one way to think about this is just if you look at the power law, right? Like, what percentage of revenue or eyeballs or whatever goes to just like the most popular things. And if you look at the power law in Hollywood, 20 years ago, it was extremely sharp, right? Like the vast majority of like worldwide, hours that people watched were things that were made, within kind of around Hollywood, around LA. And if you look at music today, the power law is still pretty sharp. Like most ear minutes, so to speak, kind of worldwide, is like for a very small number of the most popular artists that are controlled by the big music labels. And the same thing in tech. But Netflix and the Netflix model has really kind of loosened that power curve in entertainment, and we're doing that in technology.
So we'll get back into All Turtles, but I first want to ask you about your experience as Evernote CEO and bringing the company into China. And Evernote is still operational there. You've recently spun out part of the China business, but what did you do in China that worked?
Well, I haven't been involved in Evernote for about 3 years. So I wasn't the person to, for the past 3 years, basically, I haven't been spinning out. It's been doing, I think, great in China and elsewhere.
But in the initial.
Yeah, I was one of the co-founders and the CEO for about 9 years. And I think we were still probably one of the only kind of Silicon Valley companies that's been relatively successful in China. And we just did it by ignoring all the conventional wisdom. Basically, everything that we heard about what you were supposed to do in China, we just kind of did the opposite, and it worked out.
Did you agree with anything that was said on the previous panel? Which was, got some of the...
Sure. I think a lot of it... So yes and no, right? I agreed with a lot of the stuff that was said in the previous panel, but I also think a lot of it isn't like super novel about China. Like, I think you can say the same things about just about anywhere. And I think this is like a big thing. There's like, people make China seem much more mysterious and other than I think it really is. Like, I remember one of the last comments, right, was one of the panelists was saying, you really have to trust the first person you hire in China. You have to like make sure you trust that person because, they have stamps and they can steal your money. I'm like, well, what, you don't have to trust the first person you hire in the US? Like, yeah, your first employee in China has your stamps. Your employees in the US have guns. Like, you need just as much trust. I'm just not sure if a lot of this stuff that's allegedly like much more acute in China, like, is it really? Or is it just people that want to do good quality work?
So you disagree with the idea that you have to really rethink the company, really tailor it to the market in China? Is that the point you disagree with?
I think for a lot of industries, and I think that was the point that was made, right? I think that some products do really well in China that also do well in the U.S. and some don't. So I don't think there's a blanket rule. So when we were going into China, a lot of people told us, okay, you have to change the product completely because Chinese consumers they don't have the same tastes. They don't like products that are too clean. Like we actually heard this a lot. Like, oh, they want a user experience that's like more blinky stuff and more crowded, and it was just obviously stupid and wrong. Why would anyone want that?
WeChat is pretty crowded.
Well, but iPhone isn't, right? Like, it's the same product, and that really made me think. Like, when I was spending a lot of time in China, And I noticed there was a lot of GM cars on the road in China, and the GM cars in China were pretty different than the GM cars in Europe. You know, different names, like they were clearly made for the local market. And the GM cars in Brazil are different, and the GM cars in the US are different, and like GM spends a huge amount of time trying to figure out how to tailor for like each particular market, like their cars. But BMW sells like the same car everywhere. And so if you're gonna make a mediocre product, then yeah, you can probably sell more of a mediocre product by really trying to optimize it for local tastes, or you can like spend that same energy trying to make a product that's so good that it transcends the local tastes and like everyone kind of wants the same thing. And that was our approach. Like we tried to be more like Apple, to be more like BMW, and to be less like General Motors. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable strategy if that's the kind of product you're making.
Right. And when it comes to tech companies, you didn't have to deal with, you know, censorship issues in terms of being a social networking company. I mean, what were the main regulatory hurdles that you had to cross as you were building out that business?
Yeah, I mean, we did. We dealt with a lot of the internet stuff. We weren't on the tip of the spear since we weren't a social site. You know, Evernote was about personal and business productivity, so we definitely weren't as like we didn't have the spotlight, you know, on us. Although, you know, things came up, and we did have to have a Chinese version of the service that had servers in China, and you know, we had to comply with all the laws. And we had a great team over there. I spent a lot of time over there. We did have to deal with regulators and the government quite often. But you know, it wasn't easy, but it was fine. Like there's a giant country with very smart people that make good products, and you know, it was certainly worth the effort to take it seriously.
If you were still the CEO of Evernote today and you had not yet entered China and you were going to today in this very different environment where we have more heightened geopolitical risks, there's the trade wars going on, would you do anything different?
I mean, we're very interested we're not doing much in China at All Turtles right now, but I'm definitely actively pursuing it. I would like to be, because of the fact of there's heightened tensions and geopolitical differences, and like this feels like those are really good reasons to do it, to push back against it. So I think I would have been even more kind of excited to have a significant presence in China if we hadn't already done it. But again, not like because it's harder, not in spite of it. Yeah, there's an infinite number of things I would have done differently, sure. As you know, everyone learns lessons.
What's a big takeaway?
Well, I think and I don't want to speak to what Evernote is doing now. There's a whole new management team that's really good, and they're investing. For example, they're doing a lot more of the product development in China than we did. There's a big engineering team there. I was very hesitant to put in features that were specific for the Chinese market. I really had this sort of Apple BMW approach. I think now what they're actually seeing is they can develop certain things faster in China, which is not necessarily for China, but they're kind of starting in China and may or may not get exported to the rest of the world. So I think they've been the subsequent management has made some good decisions about, you know, even actually extending the investment there.
Right, so All Turtles right now is in Tokyo, you're in Paris, San Francisco, a few other international markets. What is the plan in China?
So we're trying to figure it out. Hopefully, I've just started coming back to China. You know, we hope to be fully there on the ground, you know, with a full office by the end of this year. That may not happen. The next step is to hire that super critical first person, who I have to trust. So as soon as I'm looking for recruiting now. I still have a decent network there, so I think it should be okay. But as soon as we hire kind of the person who's going to be the head of the Beijing office, then we'll kind of go along with everything else. And optimistically, we're on the ground, fully functioning there, like we are in Tokyo and Paris by the end of this year. But you know, maybe it takes another quarter or two. Like it'll still be a good idea a year later. It's not going anywhere.
And given that the focus of All Turtles is sort of incubating, creating these artificial intelligence startups, how do you see the market for AI development in the US versus China and the talent pool in each market?
Well, so the talent pool is what's always been most fascinating to me about China. Like we never thought about China as a market. Like we didn't enter the Chinese market. We don't think of it as a place to sell stuff. Like the fascinating thing about China was that the talent is there's just so much talent. There's so much great design talent. There's so much great engineering talent. The work ethic is really good. So the real reason for us to be in China is to just make stuff because we can field great teams in China, and not necessarily make stuff for China. Everything we work on is pretty global, so we like to make products that are even if they start in one country, they're really meant for a global audience. So we would do that in China as well. But talent is the number one reason. And it was the number one reason at Evernote. Like we didn't, we don't need to have people in a country in order to sell to that country. You need to have people in a country if we wanted the talent. We wanted those people to work on our product. So that's why we went there originally, and that's why we would go back now.
What's the best example of a startup that has been created out of all turtles that's now globally available?
Well, so we're only about a year and a half old, so we actually just launched our very first couple of things in the past month or two. And we focus on, technically we're not making startups, we're making products. We're not trying to make companies. We're kind of indifferent about whether or not what we make are independent companies. We really wanted like high impact products. And some of these products are separate companies, others are just products that we have and sell and book the revenue. Others are things we do as joint ventures with big corporate partners, like kind of like Netflix. Like we're not trying to make, our goal is not to incubate anything. Our goal is to make and distribute high quality
When you
things.
identify talent, do they become employees of all turtles?
In many cases, yes. So just like, again, the Netflix analogy like goes further than most people think. Like I usually say we're trying to build Netflix for tech, and like most people don't think that's entirely serious, but it kind of is. So for example, let's just say HBO, for example, when you watch Game of Thrones, at the end of an episode, there's like 8 like corporate logos that like pop up on the screen, right? And it's because like the people who made that episode weren't employed by one legal entity. They were employees of multiple different organizations. They were employed by HBO, they were employed by the production company, some of them were employed by some company that has the rights, in China versus something else. So there's a hybrid team, but while they're making the show, it's a centralized, centrally managed, very productive team. So we kind of have the same model. So everything we work on, sometimes 100% of the people are just on our payroll. They're full-time Bold Turtles employees. Sometimes they're employees of other companies. We don't really care. Like they're making a specific unified product at the time that they're making it, and then the various capital flows and rights are split up similar to the way they would be in modern Hollywood studios.
So I cut you off before you got to the best example of a successful product that's been created.
Oh, okay. So we launched, so we focus on what we call practical AI, which is, we're not deep tech, we're not cutting edge at all. We try to build products. Each of our products is something that you can explain in 1 or 2 sentences that solves a real present problem, but that would have been infinitely harder to tackle a few years ago because the AI stack wasn't there. So a good example is something we just launched called Spot. Spot is an AI for workplace harassment and discrimination reporting. The vast majority of incidents of harassment and discrimination go unreported. It's a really bad experience reporting it, both for the person reporting it as well as for the company. We've basically made an AI that you can talk to report harassment and discrimination. Launched it, I think about a month and a half ago. Selling it, getting revenue, have I think over a dozen large companies that are using it, tens of thousands of kind of reports flowing through it. And it's something that like solves a specific problem. We can get to market in about a year and a half. It's practical. It has worldwide possibilities. But had we tried to work on it 3 years ago, it would have been infinitely harder because like the tech stack to actually do this would have required a team that Google could field, but a startup couldn't. But this year we could do it. And we've got a few things in that vein. Like these are all things that are specific things that solve a real problem that we can do now that couldn't have been done a few years ago. And we can do that in the US, we can do that in Tokyo, we can do that in China, we can do that wherever.
That's an uncommon tagline you hear after AI. We're not cutting edge.
Yeah.
I think are we out of time? Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for the conversation, Phil. It was
Thank
really
you.
interesting.